Hello, everyone. This is Mr. Friedhoff. We're going to be starting our next chapter here on cellular respiration. Now, we just got done talking about photosynthesis, and within plants, that process takes in sunlight, it takes in carbon dioxide, and it takes in water, but it produces glucose and oxygen. What we're going to see in cellular respiration is that these products, or the outputs of photosynthesis, are going to be used as inputs for cellular respiration, that is, oxygen and glucose. We have this relationship with autotrophs, or the plants that we talked about last chapter, where their products, their outputs, are going to be our inputs, and our outputs, what we produce, glucose and water, are going to be their inputs. We're going to see that these reactions are going to be coupled. They're going to be working together. But basically, this is what is going to happen in cellular respiration. This is again going to be happening in the mitochondria. We're going to talk about all those things here in the next 4 sections. All right, with that being said, let's talk about what cellular respiration is. This is the process where glucose, which we made in our last chapter, is going to be broken down in our cells to produce energy. This again occurs in the mitochondria. Now, I absolutely love this diagram. This is showing how food, specifically glucose, is going to power, you can see these little gears here, so food is going to power the production of something called ATP. This ATP is going to be used for cellular work. What we have to do is we have to transfer the energy from the food we eat into something called ATP, which we're going to talk about in this chapter. But basically, we're just showing this transfer of energy from our food to our cells through this process of cellular respiration. What we're also going to see is that this is going to occur in the mitochondria. Now, like I said from the kind of intro here, our inputs are going to be glucose and oxygen. We get those from plants. This is why we need plants. We get these from the process of photosynthesis, and we're going to produce carbon dioxide, water, but we're also going to produce energy as well. We're going to produce the energy that our cells are going to use for their cellular processes. But essentially, we get this energy from the sun, since this is where plants get their energy. Like I said, photosynthesis and cellular respiration are opposite reactions, where one is going to produce the products of like CO2 and water, and that's where the other is going to take them in. Then that one's going to produce oxygen and glucose, and the other is going to take those in. But basically, these are coupled reactions, or they go together, they work in unison. I like to again show what that looks like, where the lungs of like humans or anything that's eukaryotic will take in oxygen and produce CO2, and these plants will take that CO2 in and produce oxygen. We have this big relationship or important relationship with the plants or autotrophs. All right, our next section is going to be about these molecules called ATP and ADP. ATP is known as adenosine triphosphate. This is a molecule that has 3 phosphate groups. You can see 1, 2, and 3. And you can see here this is adenosine diphosphate. This one has 2 phosphate groups. These molecules are going to be very similar, but they have very different kind of states of energy, we'll say. What these molecules, are basically our energy currency of the cell. So again, it's like having value or having energy in these molecules. So the bond between the last 2 phosphate groups is going to hold a lot of energy. When they have this bond, you can see where the phosphate groups are, it's going to be a high energy molecule. However, when it's just ADP, we don't have that bond. That's a low energy molecule. All right, so picking back up where we just talked about ATP and ADP, remember that these molecules are just going to be transferring energy. ATP is going to have the majority of the energy, while ADP is going to have a lot less energy. So again, whenever ATP transfers energy to your cells, it's going to become ADP. It's going to lose that phosphate group. What happens is this last phosphate group is going to unbind, it's going to break that bond, releasing that energy that the cell is going to use. To make ATP, we're going to need to get energy from our food to make that molecule. So again, we can remake ATP by binding that phosphate group back on. Again, there's 2 phosphates in ADP, there's 3 in ATP, but we're going to need energy from our food to do that. So basically, this is just a big cycle where ATP and ADP are either going to break off the phosphate group or add on the phosphate group. Remember, when we break it off, we get energy in our cells, but to remake the ATP and to bind that phosphate group back on, we need energy from food to do that. So I always like to think of ATP as like a charged battery and ADP like a dead battery. We can recharge the battery to put energy in it, but we need that energy from somewhere else. For us, it's going to be food. For like our electronics, obviously, it's going to be the power plants, but this is a very good analogy. Here's another way of looking at this ATP cycle. You can see we're going to get energy from the food that we eat, and specifically that comes from glucose. we're going to transfer that energy to make ATP. Now, this ATP is going to be used by our cells to do cellular work. Okay, so it's going to be used by the cells to just complete anything that the cell needs to happen. What happens then is we're going to take that ADP in a phosphate group and we're going to bond them back together by using energy from our food. So what we're seeing here is this transfer of energy from our food to ATP to our cells. Then that cell is going to make the ATP become ADP, it's losing that phosphate group, and have to be re-energized by our food. So this is just basically a big cycle that the cell is going to use in order to transfer the energy from our food to our cells. Hello, everyone. We're going to go over the last two sections here in Chapter 7. This is going to be about aerobic respiration and anaerobic respiration. So in Chapter 7.3, we're going to be talking about something called aerobic respiration. This is where glucose, our main food product, is going to be broken down and used to make ATP. Now, this type of respiration requires oxygen. It needs oxygen to occur. If oxygen is not going to be present, it's not going to occur. So again, this reaction needs oxygen. This is what you're going through right now. You have enough oxygen in your body. You're breathing in the air and you're taking that oxygen out of the air and you're using it alongside breaking down glucose to make ATP. Now, what happens is this molecule of glucose will be broken down in the cytoplasm and further in the mitochondria. There are a couple steps here called glycolysis, the prep step, the Krebs cycle, and then something called the electron transport chain. We're not going to talk about these. We get to these in like my AP class, but basically what we see is glucose is broken down in each one of these steps. It produces just a little bit of ATP until the end where we produce a majority of our ATP. Now, a byproduct that's produced through this is called carbon dioxide. This is what we breathe out. But this is how your body mainly produces ATP, or it produces that energy. Remember, though, we're just utilizing the energy that the food molecules that we're eating give us, and we're going to be transferring that energy into the ATP. So this is 7.3. This is how the energy is transferred from glucose to ATP. 7.4 is going to be kind of the exact opposite. It's about anaerobic respiration. This is where your body uses glucose, but it's not using oxygen, and it's only producing a little bit of ATP. This is not an efficient method of ATP production. And you might think, why would my body do this? Like, why would it produce only a little bit of ATP whenever, aerobic respiration produces a lot of ATP? So this is not by choice. This is by necessity. And this is when your body, your cells don't have enough oxygen. And if you think about a time when your body doesn't have enough oxygen, it's when you're rapidly going through exercise. You start breathing harder, your heartbeat starts increasing. Basically what your body is doing is it's using up all that oxygen, and so it can't go through aerobic respiration, because remember, aerobic respiration needs oxygen. What your body does is it does a separate process called anaerobic respiration. It only produces a little bit of ATP, but a little bit of ATP is better than no ATP, because again, aerobic respiration is not occurring. This is why part of the reason you feel tired when you're exercising and you're using a lot of energy, it's because you don't have enough oxygen in your body. And this is why you start breathing heavier. The other type of fermentation or anaerobic respiration is alcoholic fermentation. This is where these cauldrons or these vats are they're filled with like some sugars and some different kind of just ingredients, and yeast and bacteria will break them down and actually produce things like beers, wines, and even bread. So what happens is we make an anaerobic environment. We make an environment without oxygen, and these bacteria will actually use the sugars to produce things, like I said, like wines and beers and bread. This is going to be the end of chapter 7. This is all we're going to talk about with cellular respiration.